As Jamie said, I'm here to talk to you about the works that were carried out in the winter last year due to the development of the church into the wonderful museum you see now. One of the main areas of work was the shed at the back there, which we had to observe, which I hand excavated down, and the underpinning, which involved taking out small sections underneath areas of the wall and concreting and securing to secure the walls. So the first part of the work that I carried out was the shed area there, which as you can see was just a small square there, but where the scale wall is on the square at the top right hand corner, there's a change in the soil depth, and usually in commercial archaeology we only go down to the depth of disturbance, but I knew that the county archaeologist would ask why there was a change, so I took it down a bit more. And we discovered this mortared wall here, which is running on an east-west axis. And the earliest map of the church and the churchyard that I could find was from about 1780 from the Namahoon estate. And there's no buildings at all anywhere near the church, and especially not within the churchyard. The churchyard doesn't change from 1790 anyway, that we know. There is a church mentioned in this position, so it is likely that this church is built on top of the old church as well. So, it's not the old church, but what is it? It's about a metre thick, and it's got a clay coal wall, which is very indicative of medieval style, probably up to the Tudor. And then January this year I was digging at Llanfynan in Anglesey, where we found a similar metre thick plastered wall, which is associated with the church which was built by Llewellyn Griffiths. So it's quite likely it's a medieval wall associated with the monastic settlement, which is considered a park area there. We did a small bit of geophysics before the cable put in, just from the end to the end of the churchyard wall, and we have got a continuous line coming through as well, but the data collapsed, so we don't have a picture of that. So there is a continuation of this wall, at least another 7 metres and a metre wide, so there's definitely some building at the back there. More interesting, and the main reason why we were called out here, was the discovery of human remains in the ditch around the church. A total of about 8 or 9 skeletons in fragments appeared. We had one gentleman there in the corner who wasn't going to be affected, so we just moved the position of him. We had 2 children there with erupting teeth, but a Victorian drain had gone straight through them and smashed into pieces, so we knew had the jaws with the baby and the adult teeth coming through. There was a pair of legs which was still within a grave cut, which had Tudor pottery in, which dating from about 1540. So they were put in after 1540, but the pottery is quite posh. It's from a Bristol company. So it does mean that there was probably settlement here to warrant having its pottery come up as well, like that. So it would have been, you know, sort of high-end pottery, quite posh, and there's a drinking vessel as well. We had 2 overlaid bodies in the corner there, just where the downspout drain is, which were very smashed up as well. And we had one body which was in probably a stack, which was presumably picked up when the Victorians put the drains in and when the church was rebuilt, and they bundled it together and just stuck it back in, which is basically on any church land. The idea is to just rebury the body in the best position you can in the nicest way possible, really. And that's pretty much what happened to the remains here. They were left here and they were going to be reburied. But the most exciting, that's just the way the underpinning was done. There was a 1 to 2 metre trench holes and a gap, and then another 2 metre. They were both filled with concrete and then we dig in between, so it never exposed any of the wall to any, with having nothing underneath it. And number 8, which is the one there, you can see the excavating. We got the bottom half of the kissed grave, which is a stone-built grave with lintels and side stones, although they can be in any sort of configuration with floors and headstones as well. They've got a photo of them later. That's the lower part of it excavated, so you can just see the legs, hopefully. And the bottom there, the feet are generally gone, we've got the leg bones, and just around where the pelvis is where they stopped. and we couldn't excavate it all in one, because basically there'd be nothing under that big stone, and that big stone, if we took the other half out, there'd be nothing holding those stones up, which is roughly where that ship is there. So it was a bit of a technical challenge. So we excavated and we moved it, backfilled it with concrete and then extended. Where we found it had much more lintel stones. You've got the lintel stones on the top, and you've also just got these two pieces of quartz, which are just over the head. And there's the head, which appears the skeleton was buried on an angle. It had the legs tied together, so it was probably enshrouded, and the body was slightly turned like that. We did find 9 iron nails, so they could have either been a wooden lining, which would have straightened the body, or it could have been a small coffin. But I was talking to Dave Longley, the extractor of GAT, and he thinks it's a wooden lining. He's the expert here. These things. This is just all the different kiss types or burials from the early medieval period. And the thing about the kiss grave is it is indicative of the early medieval period. If you find one, especially an Anglesey where you don't get any bones surviving, so you can't carry out any dating, you just say 6th to 9th century straight away, and that's the end of it. And there's approximately about 47 sites at the moment, well, as of 2009, just on Gwynedd and Anglesey, which have all been given a date and of that, based solely on the type of grave that it is. That's just a map of all the current ones since the last CADU survey. I know there's 2 more in Llangefni which aren't on there, which I did when I was working for the Archaeological Trust. And I think quite recently they've had a few more as well. But the interesting thing about our body, which I'll get to now, is that nearly all the ones that we found and dated are usually male and have had quite a lot of, they've had fairly hard lives. So the one that we got is a lady, which is unique in Wales and quite unique in general for survival for North Wales. She's also comparatively old. Our archaeologist said she's an old lady, but she's probably 55 to 70. So, depending on it, Steph, our archaeologist, is only 28. So, depending on how you want to look at it. And also, she appears to be pretty healthy and has probably died of old age. She lost her front teeth quite early on, and the bone had gone over, which would probably mean there was some sort of accident, and there was some damage to one of the hips, which looks like maybe she had been stabbed or had broken it and it hadn't healed exactly right, but the hip had adjusted so she wouldn't have had a gait or anything like that. And judging by the way it had gone over, she probably went in her early teens, it was probably, but then she lived on for another 50, 60 years. Also, the most... And what we had surviving was the legs, the foot, one of the hands, the arms, the shoulder blades, the head and some of the neck, the chest cavity and the ribs pretty much gone, but they're quite spongy, so they don't usually survive. Some of the pelvis survived, which is where you get the main dating. As you can see, the male skeletons on the right-hand side and the female on the left. There's a very difference, basically, with childbirth and the shape of the head as well, but the female head is much softer shape, really, than the male. So those were the main ways as it was identified. So, having had this very exciting body, which is pretty unique to North Wales getting survival, we talked to Mainit and very kindly we arranged to get a number of tests done. We were quite lucky that we know a few people doing PhDs, so we managed to get them slightly cheaper than normal, so they could use the data. And there's a big push from the National Museum of Wales dating medieval and early medieval bodies with Katie Hunter from Sheffield University, who's recently done the ones at Llanbedrgoch, the Viking bodies that we've been dumped in the ditch, and she's doing some on Angles Bay in Pembrokeshire as well, which sort of shows she's also doing carbon dating and isotopic dating, which would show where they're coming from as well. So this is just to show you the carbon dating, that all C14 and C3 come in through animals and plants, and has different levels and different amounts depending on the type of animal, what type of food they eat, what sort of environment they come from, and all this can be identified within the human body after death. And basically C14 degrades at a certain rate, and it's kept at a certain level when you're alive, and when you die it starts degrading, and they measure how quickly it's degraded, and then they can tell roughly when you've died. It doesn't really work too well after the 1500s, but before then it's pretty accurate within 70 years. Also you can tell if they've had marine or animal or more, or they're vegetarian, depending on their diet. We've got 2 more tests to carry out which we'll double check. But strangely, for somebody who comes from Nevin with such a great seafaring history, she had a much more omnivore diet, so there's a lot of red meats, pulses and glasses. But that's only one test, there's 2 more tests to carry out which are a bit more modern, so hopefully they should be a bit more accurate. But that's the standard, though, there's hardly any marine diet in there. So, also, we're finding out what her diet was. We also got a general date of when she died, and the date is pretty unique in the whole of whole of Britain, probably a bit of France at the moment. She probably died in the late 1100s to late 1200s. It's about 1190 to 1240, which makes it a good 300-400 years later than how we've been dating kiss graves recently. So it could completely change how we've looked at that map with all those kiss grave sites on, which we've gone all early medieval, they're associated with Arthur, or however you want to interpret it, could be completely blown out of the water now because we've just got this date, which is the first time ever, so they have to really look at how we date the bodies. There's 2 or 3 other examples of burials in stone kists. There's one from Pembroke, which is a bit dodgy. There's one from Hereford, which was he's a Norman bishop, and he was buried at Hereford Cathedral, and it's documented that he requested to be buried in the old way. And the only other place in the UK where it carries on is some parts of Western Ireland and the western coast of Scotland, perhaps going as far as Orkney and the Isle of Man. So she's doing a tradition which died out 400 years at the moment. Experts, she's carrying out a tradition which shouldn't have happened at the moment here, so it's very unique, it's quite exciting, and it's got a lot of people worried as well about their interpretation. But also interestingly, she's got a lot of other things that you'd associate with early graves. The yellow stone which the grave is made out of is definitely not local to here. Nobody's really too sure. It's been sent off to be looked at by a geologist. There have been a few quarries suggested a bit further inland. So her style of burial is although Christian in orientation, it's quite un-Christian in the sense that it's got ostentation, as she's using a stone, which you're not supposed to have an elaborate grave in this period, you're supposed to, everything's to a church, and obviously would be resurrected, so you don't need any of this ostentation, but she's got stone from the outside area. Also, she's got quartz, which are above her head, and quartz found in burials goes from the prehistoric period all the way to probably the 800s, 900s again, where you've got pagan, Christian crossover. But by the 12th and 13th century, pretty much everybody is fairly standard Christian, and you don't get quartz. And there's actually an edict saying, don't put magical stones in your grave, which comes about 1310, like that. And just saying, we've sort of had enough, but as many of them are dying out. So she could be one of the last people that are carrying out this tradition, which we're not too sure what the tradition is. Roberta Gilchrist from Reading University thinks it has something to do with purity. It's the purity of the quartz crystal and water, which is sort of based on the purity of the soul, and the whiteness of the stone is associated with the purity of Jesus. So they were interpreting it as a Christian way, but the Pope and the Vatican didn't want any sort of ostentation, because you don't need it, because obviously you have the church as it is. So it's very interesting the way the late date, but if you noticed at the beginning, maybe it said behind the times, I think that is because she's practicing traditions which are maybe on paper and in the academic world as it stands, she's practicing traditions which are maybe 200 to 300 years old based on the current evidence, apart from this lady. So it's completely sort of changed the idea of ways people think. Jamie got me in touch with a gentleman in Bristol who's doing his PhD on later medieval burial, and he basically has to stop his PhD until we publish this. Because he said there's no point in me putting my PhD out there until it happens. So the final slide. And these are the final tests that we have to carry out. That's the strontium analysis, where they use teeth enamel, which we've got all her back teeth, they were fine. It was just her front teeth that had gone, although they were very worn. And as you can see from the geological marker goes through the water table and gets absorbed into your teeth and your bones, but the higher concentration would be in your teeth. And I have asked, and I have managed to get a few sheep who died and lived on the theme and around this area as a benchmark test, and they'll be tested against her teeth to see where she comes from. And they come within, it's probably, depending on the geology, you can get quite a good sort of small area of where she comes from, but it's very likely we'll be able to work out if she comes from Gwynedd gets quite big, so, but also we've got the island in Scotland, so it'd be interesting to see, considering the traditions that she's been buried with, but if she comes from a different area, say the Isle of Man or the west coast of Scotland, and she's come here, stayed here, and then as she died, she's asked for her traditions to be honoured, and they buried her in a way that she wanted. But the interesting thing is that clearly if she's been travelling here, she would have been travelling by sea, the west. It's called the Irish Sea Zone in archaeology, which is the area pretty much between here, going all the way up to the west, the Orkneys. And it's very famous in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. As a trading hub, you get different styles of Neolithic tombs, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, all the way up to early medieval, and you only really get the break when Edward I basically comes in, and you get trading with his French territories, but you don't get trading with Ireland and stuff like that. So for nearly 3,000-4,000 years, you get this territory where it's very active in the Irish Sea Zone. But for somebody who would have been presumably travelling here by boat to have absolutely, I think, 2% marine food in her bone collagen is very odd. So she would have come from inland, got a boat, ended up here, never ate fish. So yeah, it's very, very interesting, and there's a lot more to come, and it has absolutely changed the perception of early medieval burial and medieval burials. She's probably one of the only surviving, apart from Town Chapel near Holyhead, of late medieval burials in North Wales. And it's literally Town Chapel, I think, had 124 burials, but none in kists. Like that, and then there's here, and then there's some near Dolgellau, and there's a few down Goldcliff and Bally Island, and after that there's nothing really unless it's associated with a grand house or a castle. They're just a normal person in a normal community. There's nothing. So although it's very short talk, it's very actually and it's only one single find, so it's sort of. It's only one single body, so you might not think it's that exciting, but actually her one single body has sort of changed the perception of Welsh medieval history. So hopefully the National Museum will try and do some more work as well with Katie Humner from Sheffield, because they're very interested as well in continuing their studies of early medieval burials, and as she's available, they may look at her again as well, so we get further reports. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'm sorry it's quite short, but welcome to ask any questions.